Nobody in that room expected Daniel Goldman to read the document out loud. That was the assumption. That was the unspoken agreement that governs how these things usually work. That sensitive documents appear in hearings as references, as exhibits, as the basis for questions that circle around their contents without ever directly exposing them. That the document sits on the table, and its existence is acknowledged, and its implications are debated, and the specific words inside it remain, for practical purposes, contained. Goldman had a different plan. Not a different political plan. A different evidentiary one, the kind that former federal prosecutors develop when they approach a problem not as a politician looking for leverage, but as a lawyer building a record that will outlast the moment it is created. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, not preparing in the way that most congressional questioners prepare, assembling a list of pointed questions designed to generate the most damaging exchange possible within the allotted time. Preparing the way a former federal prosecutor prepares for the most important cross-examination of a significant case. Methodically, sequentially, with every word of the document memorized and every possible response to its contents anticipated and a plan for each of those responses ready before he walked through the door. The hearing had been running for nearly 2 hours when Goldman's time arrived. The topic was the Epstein files. Specifically, the documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein's network that had been withheld, classified, partially released, and then quietly absorbed into the institutional machinery of agencies with the power and the incentive to manage what the public knew and didn't know. The Epstein files occupy a specific and unusual place in the American public consciousness. They are simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, constantly referenced, endlessly debated, the subject of documentaries and investigations and congressional inquiries that generate enormous attention without ever fully resolving the central questions they raise. What was in those files? Who was in those files? And what the institutions responsible for investigating and prosecuting Jeffrey Epstein knew about the people connected to him that they chose, for reasons that have never been fully explained, not to pursue. The witnesses before the committee had spent the morning doing what witnesses in these hearings do, characterizing the situation in terms favorable to the positions they were there to defend, offering context, providing framing, presenting a version of events that was technically accurate in its individual components and deeply misleading in its overall shape. Goldman had listened to all of it. He had taken notes. He had tracked every characterization, every framing choice, every carefully constructed non-insert that had been delivered from the witness table over the previous 2 hours. He had built, in the margins of his notes, a precise map of where the testimony diverged from the document, and when his time came, he did not open with a speech. He opened with the document. He placed it flat on the desk in front of him. He looked at the witnesses. He said he was going to read from it directly. And then, without waiting for an objection that might have slowed him down, he began. What he read was not what anyone in that room had expected to hear read aloud in an open congressional hearing. The document, a record that had been formally requested by members of the committee, produced in a form that obscured its most significant contents, and then identified by Goldman staff through independent research as containing information that the produced version had omitted, described a specific set of connections between Epstein's documented activities and individuals who occupied positions of significant institutional and political power. Connections that had been known to the relevant federal agencies, connections that those agencies had made specific decisions about in terms of what to investigate, what to pursue, and what to allow to remain unexamined. Goldman read the relevant sections. He read them completely, without paraphrase, without the careful softening that turns a specific, damaging document into a general, manageable concern, in the precise language of the official record, with the dates and the names and the institutional designations intact. The room went still in a way it had not been still at any point in the previous 2 hours, not the procedural stillness of a hearing, proceeding through its agenda, the specific, weighted stillness of a room in which everyone present has just heard something that they understand, simultaneously and without discussion, cannot be unheard. The witness's response was immediate. Senior official at the table raised an objection about the appropriateness of reading from a document whose full classification status he said he could not verify in open session. Goldman noted that the document had been produced to the committee through the department's own formal process, and that its classification status was reflected. In the header he had read at the outset, the official said he would need to consult with counsel before responding to specific contents. Goldman said he understood and continued reading. This is the detail that matters most in understanding what Goldman did in that hearing room. He did not stop. In a proceeding governed by institutional courtesies and procedural norms that generally favor the witness over the questioner, Goldman made a specific and deliberate choice to use his allotted time to complete the record he had come to create. Regardless of the objections being raised around him, he had the time, he had the document, he had the legal authority to read from a document that had been formally produced to the committee, and he had the preparation to know exactly which sections to read and in what sequence to read them, so that the record he was creating would be complete, coherent, and impossible to dismiss as selective, and he used all of it to understand why the Epstein document Goldman was reading carries the institutional weight it carries. You need to understand something about how information gets buried in Washington. It rarely disappears entirely. The bureaucratic reality of a large federal government is that records are created, filed, stored, and retained in ways that make true destruction both difficult and legally dangerous. The people responsible for managing sensitive information understand this, which means that the primary tool available to them is not elimination but management, controlling access, shaping what gets produced in response to requests, ensuring that the version of the record that reaches external audiences is the version that is least damaging to the interests the record keepers are protecting. That management produces gaps. Not dramatic, obvious gaps that announce themselves as evidence of wrongdoing. Subtle ones, technical ones, gaps that exist in the space between what a formal document request legally requires and what the responding agency chooses to interpret as within scope. Gaps in redaction decisions where the legal standard permits but does not require withholding. Gaps in production timelines that ensure certain materials arrive after certain proceedings have concluded. Gaps between what was requested and what was produced. Gaps between what the full record shows and what the produced record reveals. Gaps that are, individually, defensible. Each withholding has a justification. Each omission has an explanation, but that, viewed in aggregate, tell a story about the systematic management of information that is more significant than any individual decision. Goldman had found the gap. This is work that takes time, serious time, the kind of careful, unglamorous document comparison that requires reading the produced version of a record alongside independent versions obtained through other channels, and identifying, line by line, where the two diverge and what the divergence means. His staff had done that work. They had identified the specific point at which the document produced to the committee diverged from the complete record, the pages that were missing, the sections that had been redacted beyond what the applicable legal standards required, the information that had been present in the original and absent in the version delivered to Congress. And Goldman had obtained the original, not through a leak, not through a source whose identity and motives could be used to discredit what he was about to present, through the kind of independent documentary research that a well-resourced congressional office can conduct when it has reason to believe that the formal production of records has been incomplete. The second section of the document he read addressed something that the morning's witnesses had directly denied, a specific claim about what the relevant federal agencies had known, and when they had known it, the document showed they had known earlier than they had, said not slightly earlier, not the kind of difference that might be explained by imprecision in describing a complex timeline, significantly earlier, in a way that changed the meaning of every decision that had followed. When Goldman finished reading the second section, he looked up from the document. He asked the senior official whether he wanted to revise the testimony he had given earlier in the morning. The official said. He stood by his testimony. Goldman, read the relevant section one more time. The third time he looked up, he did not ask a question. He simply noted, for the record, that the official's testimony and the document were not consistent. That notation is now part of the permanent congressional record. Whatever the witnesses said in the minutes that followed, whatever the official statements issued by the relevant agencies in the hours after the hearing, whatever the political operations surrounding the individuals named in the document produced in the way of counter-narrative and context, and reframing that notation exists independently of all of it. It is in the transcript. It is sourced to a document. The document is in the record as an exhibit, and the inconsistency Goldman identified between what was said under questioning and what the hidden pages of an official federal record show is documented with the specificity that makes it impossible to explain away with a sufficiently polished statement. The third time Goldman looked up from the document, after he had read the inconsistency into the record, and given the witness the opportunity to revise and the witness had declined, he said something that did not need a follow-up question. He said the record would reflect what it reflected, and it does. This is what Goldman understood when he walked into that hearing room with the document. He understood that the Epstein files are not going to resolve themselves, that the gaps in the public record are not going to close because the people managing them would prefer they remain open, that the witnesses who appear before congressional committees to answer questions about what the relevant agencies knew and did are going to continue offering the managed version of events for as long as no one forces the unmanaged version into the open record. He forced it, not by making an accusation, not by delivering a speech about the victims or the accountability that has been denied for too long, not by performing outrage for the cameras in a way that would generate a clip and then be absorbed, into the political noise. By reading the document. By doing the one thing that the management of sensitive information is designed to prevent, putting the actual words of the actual official record into the actual open transcript of a congressional proceeding where they become permanent and public and available to anyone who wants to find them. By putting the specific language of the official federal record, the language the agencies had created, the language that described what they knew and what they decided, into the permanent transcript of a congressional hearing, where it will remain regardless of what anyone does next. The Epstein files are large. The full accounting of what they contain will take time to develop through the slow processes of litigation, investigation, and congressional oversight that are the legitimate mechanisms for establishing that account. But in that hearing room, on that morning, Goldman added something specific and permanent and irreversible to the public side of that accounting that had not been there before. A document, read out loud. In full, on the record, and Trump, whose name appears in the connections. That document describes connections that the witnesses had spent the morning characterizing in terms carefully chosen to minimize their significance, had no answer for what was read. Neither did the witnesses, neither did the institutions behind them. The document was hidden. Not perfectly, not invisibly, hidden in the way that important documents get hidden in Washington through procedural management and selective production and the reasonable expectation that no one will do the work required to find what was not produced. Goldman did that work. He read the document anyway. All of it. In public, on the record, and the room, the entire room, with its cameras and its staff, and its witnesses and its members who had spent 2 hours here in the managed version of events, went silent the moment he began. Because silence is what happens when the managed version runs out of places to hide. So what do you think about what Daniel Goldman did in that hearing, when he chose to read the document out loud, not summarize it, not reference it, but put every word on the record? Did that change how you see what was said earlier in the room? Or do you think there's still more context behind what was read that we're not seeing here? Let me know your take in the comments. I read every single one, and if you want more breakdowns of the moments where the record says more than the testimony, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Capital Clash so you don't miss what comes next.